We're now going back to looking at Proposition 21 and 22. Tim, Proposition 21, let's start with that. This is the one that has to do with the annual fee for drivers to have the money go and fund the state parks. Tell us about this one.
Well, yes, it would place an $18 surcharge on the fees that you pay everybody who owns a car pays each year to register that car. And the idea is, here is you pay something and you get something in return. Is anyone then who has a car registered in California with California license plates would get free admission, parking and day use at all the state parks. So there is a bit of a nexus here. You pay on your car gets into the park for free. So that's the idea. And the idea behind it is it was really the brainchild of the State Parks Foundation, people around the state who are concerned about the state parks, that chronically the state parks have been underfunded. They are understandably so a lower priorities when the state is cutting budgets to education and various human services and prisons and public safety. So chronically they've been underfunded. The state of the parks is they're physically in bad shape and in bad repair. Trails, restrooms, the historical parks with Fort Tejon or Fort Sutter or even Hearst Castle, although that's a whole different breed. But the maintenance backlog is huge. That okay, let's find a way to settle this. Let's get the state parks their source of funding, make it so there's a connection so that people who pay those surcharges can get in free rather than having to pay to park every time you take your family down to San Buenaventura State Beach or Carpinteria State Beach for an outing in the summertime. And let's take care of the parks.
So we're actually dedicating a certain amount of money. Once this money goes to the parks, in the past we've seen where the legislature or the governor comes along and says, you know what, changed our mind, we're going to take that money and use it somewhere else because we're desperate. Is this money walled off, or is it also subject to being rated later?
Well, the bulk of it is walled off. It would generate enough so that there might be, the legislature might be able to use some of the revenues for other purposes, but the bulk of it is and it wouldn't, you get to the question of supplant or supplement. Well, this would essentially become the funding source for state parks. The existing amount of money that the state parks get out of the general fund, they would there's no question of it that the state, will the state need to keep contributing to that? No. This is going to be the source of funding for state parks and various wildlife conservation activities, ocean protection and wildlife conservation and that kind of activity.
Now the arguments against it, one of them written by our own local supervisor, Peter Foy, talk about that this is really back to ballot box budgeting, or it's a way of slipping in the car tax a little higher to do this. So even though it's well-meaning, it's really not the best way for the future of California. I mean, how does the other side respond to that?
Well, I think the ballot box argument, we've heard that on a number of issues. And California clearly has, there have been initiatives passed that set in funding levels for education, for transportation, for preschool, for after school, for early childhood development, for mental health. It goes on down the line. There's hardly an area of the state budget that doesn't have some requirement that's been put into statute or the Constitution by initiative. So it's something we're very familiar with in California, and there are good arguments. Why shouldn't we just take all these whips and chains out of the budgeting process and let the legislature and the governor make independent decisions every year based on the priorities? But voters seem to like to have that decision themselves.
Well, I guess no one's trusting the government to do the job, so I guess voters are having to do it. Final question on this one, looking at who supports it, who opposes it, I see that it's not necessarily environmental interests, that you have nurses and teachers who are supporting Prop 21. Who are some of the others?
Well, I think the nurses and teachers and and advocates of the other competing public services that are all now competing for the same pot of money. Every $1 million the state spends on park and wildlife programs is $1 million they don't spend on K through 12 education or health care. So there's that. But I think generally the support is coming from the environmental community, which is very concerned about the state of California's parks and natural resources protections.
And I think when we see the recession that's devastated so many families, I mean, having access to parks, I guess that's a compelling argument for their side.
Yeah. There is an issue of how, if the carrot is you get free admission to the state park, I mean, clearly there are urban areas in this state, in East Los Angeles, where state parks really aren't part of people's lives. They just don't have the opportunity, the access to enjoy the state parks, yet they'd be paying the $18 surcharge as well. So, there is a question, but if your personal interest is, will I get any benefit from that? Well, the fact is, those of us who live along the coast probably will, and those of us who live in urban areas, maybe not.
That's a great argument. So it just reminds voters that one of the things to do is look in your voter pamphlet guide, which is being circulated now by the Secretary of State for all of these arguments. Tim, let's move on to Proposition 22. This deals with somewhat of an arcane issue, I think, that only people who are following Sacramento closely know about, this whole thing between cities and counties borrowing funds from different projects. Tell us how this works.
Well, yeah, I believe this is, somebody actually kept track, it may be the 19th or 20th time that measures have gone to the ballot since 1978 trying to deal with the repercussions of Proposition 13 on state and local government financial relations. Proposition 13 back in 1978, which cut the property taxes in half in one fell swoop, that had always historically been the source of financing for cities and counties and special districts and largely schools. And then the state had to bail out these entities for the loss of tax revenue. And then Proposition 13 also gave the legislature the authority to decide how the property taxes were going to be allocated. And so that's become a source of contention. The local governments have come to think of the portion of that goes to them as theirs, and the state should keep their hands off of it. So we did have, just a couple of years ago, Proposition 1A, which did make it, put severe restrictions on the state's ability to divert a portion of these local entities' property taxes to the state. They could do it only twice in a 10-year period, and when they did it, they had to pay it all back within 2 years. This goes a little further. This eliminates that exemption, and I don't think that's really the important part of Proposition 22, but it extends that protection to redevelopment agencies. Redevelopment agencies, this might be a surprise to a lot of people, get about 12% of all the property taxes that are paid in California. They use this money for economic development and to provide, subsidized rent to developers who will come in, cheap use of the land. They not for direct public services. And so last year, in its budget deal, the legislature and the governor agreed, well, we're going to take about $2 billion from the redevelopment agencies and divert that instead into those school districts in those same areas of the redevelopment agencies served. That's about 15% of all the redevelopment money. So this really goes into another area. This is a whole new area of giving redevelopment agencies this bulletproof protection against having any of their property taxes diverted.
I see. It sounds like this is another one where voters need to read that voter information guide to see the arguments both for and against. Well, that wraps up for us Proposition 22.